All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Books and Books in Coral Gables. Thank you all for coming down on this very special night. As you can see by the lights and the cameras, we're live streaming this event on the internet. A message for our internet audience at home. If at any time you'd like to purchase a copy of Mr. Greenberg's book, just call the number on your screen. We'll have Mr. Greenberg sign it for you, and we will have it shipped to you anywhere in the United States free of charge. For those of you watching overseas, the shipping charge might be a little bit more. This evening, Books and Books is honored to present Mr. Allan Greenberg, presenting his beautiful new book, Allan Greenberg, Classical Architect. Mr. Greenberg, whose firm has offices in New York, Washington, D.C., and Greenwich, Connecticut, has taught at Yale University, the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, and the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of several books, including Architecture of Democracy, American Architecture, and the Legacy of the Revolution. Mr. Greenberg is one of the most influential architects of the classical movement. A leading exponent of classical architecture, he has drawn on a vast knowledge of ancient styles in the design of his illustrious list of projects. This book celebrates Mr. Greenberg's esteemed career by showcasing in depth his private houses, apartments, university buildings, and civic buildings that demonstrate his lifelong commitment to traditional styles, unparalleled quality, and decorative expression. And here to introduce Mr. Greenberg, we have a special guest. He is a former associate of Mr. Greenberg's. Please welcome to the podium Mr. Jonathan Hogg.
Thank you. I'm going to keep it very brief. I think that gives a very good oversight of Allan's career and so forth. But maybe I can say something about how much he inspired me and plenty of us who've worked with him, and he certainly had many great architects who have worked with him in the past. But it's the open-mindedness that strikes me the most. As much as Allan is rigorous in the detail about what he might be doing for a particular building, it's his openness and his ideas that are very, very fresh. It's not dogmatic, and that's one of the most inspiring things working with him. But in terms of the man, you know, his mind is constantly moving, and he's always has new ideas, and you're always looking at the world in a different way. And so that's just wanted to keep it brief. And Allan, it's on to you.
Thank you all for coming. Mitch, thank you for organizing this event. When I started as a student in South Africa, in, I hate to say it, 56 actually, I was a student in South Africa at the bottom of the African continent, and the one thing I felt was far away from everything in the world. And my dream was to go to architecture school somewhere else in the world, in a major center like London or somewhere in New York. But I was in South Africa. And at the age of 16 going on 17, I was in architecture school, first-year student. And it turned out, in retrospect, that the architectural education I got in South Africa, studying both modern, medieval, and classical architecture, was something quite unique. There isn't another place in the world where I could have gotten a similar education. One of the first things we did was study the history of South African architecture. And in 1652, the Dutch settled in South Africa, in Cape Town, and brought with them their architecture. This is the center of a vineyard in Stellenbosch. It's a house called Vergelegen, and it is very Palladian in its plan and organization, but the gables are clearly Dutch in origin, and compared to other similar houses in South Africa, it is much more fanciful in the form and treatment of the gables. Big sliding sash windows that are at least 10 foot high, which would give you a sense of the scale of the house. On the very first day of architecture school, we were given a pad of white paper and told to go to the Johannesburg Art Gallery and spend the day drawing there. It was only later that I learned and fully understood that this building was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, who, in my estimation, was one of the 2 or 3 great architects of the 20th century. But I was impressed particularly by the inside of the building, by the beautiful lighting, by the scale of the windows, and the delicacy and quirkiness of the moldings. Early in the 20th century, Sir Herbert Baker, a friend of Lutyens, came to South Africa and designed the a new residence for the Prime Minister. And in 1900, looking back to 1652, he designed a variation on the same Dutch house, this time with a porch added to the front of it, 3 gables, and the center set back, but still recognizing the tradition. Another Baker house, stone, arts and crafts in character, became part of the South African vernacular. Very different from an English house because of the terraces on each 2 floors of them, the hot climate, fresh air, etc. I'm sorry, I can see I'm going to have endless problems with this. We were also asked to draw and study the orders and to design buildings using them. Usually, we started like this and had to end up with a 3-dimensional projection of the orders on the diagonal, casting shadows, which took weeks to draw and to render. Now, the odd thing about this architecture school, the University of the Witwatersrand, was it had two suns, S-U-N-S, so to speak. One was the past, one was tradition, and the other was Le Corbusier. And there was never any contradiction between studying the past and studying Le Corbusier. They were presented as part of the same continuum of architectural history. And here we see Le Corbusier, who really was presented as a classical architect in the sense that he took the tradition, turned it precisely 180 degrees, rotated it on its head, and reacted to the tradition. So instead of having columns rise up through the buildings and the buildings sitting on the ground, he uses the columns to lift the building off the ground. Instead of having windows which are holes in heavy walls, he shows you a continuous band of openings which run completely around the building. and instead of placing the building in the garden, he places the garden in the building. It is a perfect and total opposition, and thereby, because it depends on reaction, is still within the tradition. That's what makes him different. It's what makes Mies van der Rohe different. It's what makes Alvar Aalto different from all the other modern architects of the early 20th century. And you can see it here. He traveled extensively and studied especially Michelangelo, early Renaissance buildings, and had a particular love for the Acropolis. Again, as in Le Corbusier's worldview, architecture was continuity with the past. The other figure I became more and more familiar with in architecture school through the dean of the architecture school, a man by the name of John Fassler, who had started out as a disciple of Le Corbusier, but ended up as dean of the school, loving the architecture of Sir Edwin Lutyens, and being a particularly headstrong and arrogant young student. He and I crossed swords many times on the virtues of Lutyens versus Le Corbusier. And he would always take me down to the library. We'd open Le Corbusier's Œuvre Complète and the Lutyens Memorial volumes and compare buildings. As I got older, I realized, of course, that he was right. When I eventually graduated and left South Africa, I had wanted to work on the Sydney Opera House. As a student, I had taken a year off and spent it in Europe in an unceasing effort to get a job in Le Corbusier's office. And after a siege lasting 3 months, he took me to lunch and asked me a lot of questions about South Africa. And if you look at the first volume of the Œuvre Complète, you will see that there is a letter to a South African architect, Rex Martiensen. His first disciples were really in Johannesburg. And he also asked me if I knew of an unknown Danish architect by the name of Jorn Utzon. And I said, yes, I have seen a little sketch of his winning design for the Sydney Opera House, and Le Corbusier expressed much interest in this. Eventually, after 3 meetings, he said, look, you are really persistent. You're like a mosquito in India that will not go away. I will give you a job, but you have to work for nothing for a year before you'll be of any use to me. And I had to politely decline. Now, this offer was made in his office, which is this famous 3-meter cube, 10 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot. It was this little cubicle in this 12 or 15 foot high office. And he could see that I was really crestfallen. And he then reached behind his desk and pulled out from behind his seat this beautiful 3 foot high Indian basket with all his crushed up pieces of tracing paper in it. And he said, look, Allan, I really don't have much to teach you, and you don't have much to learn working in this office. The only thing I can tell you is that good architecture is really hard work. What he didn't add, which I've now learned, is that the older you get, the harder it becomes. But I was fortunate in spending a year in Jorn Utzon's office working on this building, which was a total revelation, both for the architecture and for its integrity, and for the unique way in which Jorn Utzon solved design problems. I also then went up to, Utzon moved to Australia to finish the building, and I went on to Finland and was particularly interested in the works of Alvar Aalto. This is a very early 20s Aalto church, and you can see it's a northern, stripped down, bare bones classical building that is exquisitely beautiful on the inside and the outside. After a year in Finland, I moved on to Sweden. I spent a year working there and became fascinated by the architecture of the 18th century Nicodemus Tessin, who designed the Gothenburg Law Court, which is on your left-hand side on the bottom slide. And Gunnar Asplund spent at least 12 years designing an addition to this building. One of his early schemes was taking the building down and proposing an arts and crafts building in what was called the national style. On the drawing below, he keeps Tessin's beautiful building and adds a similar building to its right. There you see the Tessin building with its exquisite proportions, its bare bones, Nordic detailing, and his addition on the side. On the second floor, the windows with the panels above them indicate the extent of the courtyard. Tessin's building is U-shaped, Asplund's building is U-shaped, and between them they have a courtyard. Asplund struggled for years to find a way to add on to this building, and eventually, influenced by Le Corbusier and others, he tried to find a compromise between classical and modern architecture and came up with this interesting hybrid. And here you see the inside. The difference between the two buildings is that Asplund enclosed his courtyard with an exquisite wall of glass and a bridge. The white concrete slab, the thin white concrete slab going across is actually a bridge with a staircase cut through in the middle of it. And then you have the U-shaped series of courtrooms going around the building. But the windows with panels indicate the depth of this courtyard. And you can see the interior was uncompromisingly modern, but handled with a delicacy you really only find in Asplund and Alvar Aalto's work. It's something in Scandinavia. U-shaped steel columns covered in stucco. Notice how on your right the balustrade running around the two-story space has panels wherever above the tables next to them. There's not only light flooding in from the courtyard, but from two different skylight systems above. I left Scandinavia to come to the United States. I was very fortunate in getting a scholarship at Yale, and much as I loved my time in Sweden in particular, I felt I had to come to a place where they spoke English all the time. And although I could speak Swedish, I found it difficult to live there because in every architectural office there was an encyclopedia called Bug. It had 8 volumes, and each volume was about 2 inches thick, using very thin paper. The problem was Bug covered everything from building harbors to dams, bridges, roads, and buildings. But if it wasn't in Bug, you couldn't do it. It was the ability to live within this very closely knit set of rules that I found very difficult. And I think maybe it's a characteristic of English-speaking countries that the mind is more expansive and we want more opportunities to explore things. So I came to the United States, was lucky enough to get a scholarship from Yale, and was the second generation of students to use Paul Rudolph's amazing art and architecture school. And which you can see here with its rough concrete walls. You can see the goddess Minerva or Athena behind Rudolph, or Mr. Rudolph as he was known and called, sitting on a sample of the building's concrete wall. I'm sorry. The other wonderful thing about coming to Yale was the old buildings, the traditional Yale Courtyards. And although most members of the faculty and most of the members of the art history faculty used to laugh and make jokes about these Gothic quadrangles designed by James Gamble Rogers starting in 1920 all the way up to 1954 when they were eventually finished. Paul Rudolph, whose office was one block away, would close his office sometimes at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and he'd always come to the studio and see who was working there and what was going on. And because I had 2 young children, I tended to spend most of my time in school working at night, where I had peace and quiet. And I had designed for one of our first projects a series of courtyards for a housing scheme, and he came up 1 o'clock and sat next to me and said, "Allan, look, have you seen the Gothic quadrangles at Yale?" And I said, "No." And he drew me a very comprehensive map of the Yale campus. He knew I lived in the married student housing, which he had designed. And he said, "Look, you follow this route. Just follow the arrows on this map and study the courtyards. This man is a great architect, and everybody can laugh at him, but great architecture shines a beacon all on its own. You just have to see it." So I followed his instructions and came back the next morning in the reverse route and realized that these buildings were in fact marvelous. And I hope there's nobody from England here, but I think they are the equal of anything I've seen at Oxford and Cambridge. I also very quickly became interested in American architecture. This really was initiated by the fact that the United States is the only country which had a revolution, and where the people who provided the foundation of the revolution, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were also architects and determined the character of the architecture of the new republic. So this is a early 18th century courthouse in Virginia, a federal courthouse in New Jersey, and after the revolution, the house became the model for our buildings. In the first few words of the Constitution say, we the people are the government, we constitute this nation. So in a sense, the major public buildings of the United States are its government, its people's homes. So we have the original name for the Congress was the Congress House, not the Capitol. Jefferson changed it to the Capitol. But we still have courthouses, jailhouses, schoolhouses, poorhouses, etc., etc. And so the building where the people of the county of Burlington in New Jersey seek justice is a house, but it belongs to it's the home of the community, so to speak, not a single person. And it's not only the formal buildings where the community was wealthy enough to be able to afford high architecture. This is a schoolhouse just north of Sacramento in California, built in the late 19th century. But in its symmetry, in its bell tower and its little porch, it is a simplified classical building. And in its form is very similar to a house, in this case, a schoolhouse. And then our ultimate house is the Congress House, the United States Capitol, and the space under the Great Dome is not for the Senate, which is pushed off to one side. It is not for the House, which is pushed off on another. It's not for the President, who's in a house, the White House, down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was designated the hall of the people. It is our house. Now, in 1974, I had completed my first two buildings. This one was influenced by Gunnar Asplund, by the Gothenburg Law Courts. In fact, the windows were imported from Sweden and are similar to the ones that Asplund used. It's the addition to the Connecticut State Library and Supreme Court building. It houses chambers for the justices, a library, some administrative offices, etc. At the same time, I did this addition to a 17th century salt box in Connecticut. It's 1689 or thereabouts. Raised one side of the attic, pulled out a kitchen family room, and connected it with a small porch, inspired by shingle-style work of Stanford White. And I realized that I had to decide whether I was going to be a classical or a modern architect. And I confronted the following dilemma. On the one hand, Le Corbusier, this is his plan Voisin of 1925 for Paris. You can see the Seine River, and on the bottom, on the left, you can see the U-shaped courtyards of the Louvre, and then these 50-story, 50, 60-story high cruciform-shaped skyscrapers for offices and residences set within the fabric of Paris. Le Corbusier's new city, which was eventually planned to expand and really exterminate the Paris we know and love, which you see here in this beautiful painting by Camille Pissarro of Paris in the rain, with its fountains, its street life, its sidewalk cafes, and in the far distant you can see the outline of Charles Garnier's beautiful opera house. This is the Paris we still love to visit and cherish. So I realized modern architecture was urbanistically limited. Its goal really was not to enhance city life, but to replace it with something different. This is a courthouse, and it's a federal courthouse, as you see from the sign. But if you took that sign off and you put IBM or Lever Brothers or Kraft Foods, the building would still be okay. It is in fact indistinguishable from most new university buildings, most public buildings, many private industrial type buildings. It is a building which belongs in no place and nowhere. This was a courthouse I did in 1978. The state had very limited funds, and this was done for a shoestring within the framework of an existing supermarket, which the state bought, cleared, and just by redesigning the outside wall, putting an arch, some rusticated stones, the arched windows, a diagrammatic entablature and pediment, one could suggest that this was in fact a courthouse. Modern architecture has no symbolism. It is incapable of incorporating the entire symbolic apparatus of 5,000 years of Western architecture. And of course, it can't deal with context. On the left, you have Lever House, designed in the early 1950s by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Not really a skyscraper, but a building which turns its back to the street and actually opens up the leftover walls of buildings surrounding it. If he had designed a traditional building which would fill up the block, it would relate to the racket club on the left and occupy this entire block. On the other hand, in 1931, Shreve, Harman, and Lamb designed the Empire State Building. And like Lever House, they separate the bottom and the top. The 5-story base, which is architecturally different from the top, is about the height of many of the older New York City brownstones which used to surround this site. And the successive setbacks on the Empire State Building as the tower rises also relate to different periods of early 20th century New York City architecture. But the point I want to make is that as you walk past the Empire State Building on Fifth Avenue, the base of the building is quite traditional. It has storefronts lining the street. It is not out of scale with everything else. And what Shreve, Harman, and Lamb did was to push the tower back so it didn't disrupt the urbanistic sense of the street. And the tower is in fact also a symbol of New York City. If Meg Ryan and her boyfriend are going to meet, Tom Hanks, are going to meet at 8 o'clock at night anywhere in New York, it wouldn't be on the top of the roof of the Lever House or in the old days of the New York Trade Center or of any other building, but it makes sense to meet on the top balcony level of the Empire State Building because this building is the center of New York. And it couldn't be anywhere else. It couldn't be in Dubai or any other, Europe, Russia, any other city in the world. So, having made my commitment in the mid-70s to be a classical architect, I really didn't know whether I would be able to make a living. And I really hoped that, at best, being the only classical architect in the United States who at least was under 60 or 70 years old, I would be able to support my family and maybe a small office. In 1978, I was contacted by Peter and Sandy Brandt, who have one of the great collections of modern art, to design their home in Greenwich. And Peter, in particular, was fixated with Mount Vernon. And as I grappled with this challenge, I realized that Mount Vernon is the nemesis of all classical architects. McKim Eden White, John Russell Pope, and many other architects of their generation faced the same challenge, and I saw how each of them had done it. And my particular choice was to make the columns a little fatter. They generally chose to make them thinner. I chose to pair the columns rather than make them single. Mine are round, George Washington's are square, and he had 7 bays, I have 5. My next house, done soon after in the early 80s, was much smaller for a couple who were disco dancers. He was in his late 60s and she was in her 40s. I think between them they had 8 marriages. And but the 2-story ballroom on your right was in fact where they held disco dances. And the whole house, like the Villa Rotunda, was a party house. When George Shultz was Secretary of State, he and the curator of the State Department, Clem Conger, asked me to redesign a suite of 40 rooms into offices for the Secretary of State and Deputy Secretary of State, and eventually connecting 2 elevators, a suite of rooms called the Treaty Signing Suite, which you can see actually here. I was fortunate in the mid-80s to be asked by Bergdorf Goodman to redo most of their Fifth Avenue facade, and particularly to put in a major doorway. Up to 1975, Bergdorf did not have a major door on Fifth Avenue. Its main entries were on 57th and 58th Street. And they wanted a sign, which, not quite neon, but they wanted a big bang for the buck. In addition to a house on the campus of the University of Virginia, it's one side of the house is Greek Revival. The side we're looking at was colonialized in 1905. And the addition I put on it, I was the 3rd architect hired to do this job because the donor wanted buildings which related to each other. And the conceit here is that my addition on the left-hand side, which is smaller, but the detailing suggests that it is in fact an older building, whereas in fact it is really the new building. The last building site on the historic sunken garden of the College of William and Mary. Again, the trustees of the university called me down to Williamsburg and said, look, this building is the last building site in this historic center. We can't entrust it to Buildings and Grounds, so you will work throughout this project with the trustees of the university, which I did. And my client, in fact, was a man who built ships. in Norfolk, Virginia, and this was the building that I designed for them and was eventually realized. In its details, it goes back to 17th century England, particularly to the work of Wren and his school. Wren's son is supposedly the architect of the Wren building at the head of this sunken garden, which was the first building at William and Mary. Getting on in the 1980s, a house in Connecticut. Different in style. The client wanted these big stone walls. The first floor, actually, the walls are sloped in at about 3 degrees or 3.5 degrees, and with wood and stucco above it. House in northwestern Connecticut, done for a famous tennis player from Central Europe who really wanted a formal stone house. This house, done in the 90s, is in Woodside, California. It has a 2-story garden room. As its center, this faces the garden with its terrace, and on the entrance side, it has these pools which descend to the lower level of the entrance garden, framed by trees. This is really a small house, much like the house belonging to the disco dancing husband and wife. But was recently sold for $117.5 million, which is the most expensive house ever sold in the United States. I don't know how long this will be, but at the moment, that's where it is. This is the staircase inside. Balusters of square stainless steel balusters shaped like a spiral, and every 2 of those are separated by a baluster made of glass. A house in Short Hills, New Jersey. The back of the house, again, very different from the front. And the cross axis with the staircase, which takes you up to the 2nd floor. This goes right through the house. And the conceit in this house is that the most beautiful room in the house is actually the kitchen. It's a very elaborate kitchen. You can see the cabinets which form the semicircular end actually zigzag round the semicircle, and the cornice on the ceiling actually follows them. The ceiling moldings, again, are the most elaborate in the house, and everything else, including the round table, was custom designed for this space. This is a Victorian house, 1870s, in Connecticut, with a new addition. The addition started as a conservatory-like wooden structure, and as it evolved, it became a steel and glass design, inspired by Mies van der Rohe, who, like Le Corbusier, saw no division between the classical past and his modern buildings. The rear of the building, where the pilasters framing the dining room on the right-hand side are mirrored in the projecting 2-story steel and glass component. Oh, sorry. A house in New England, which started as a large single mass, and as it evolved and related to its site and to the surrounding garden, became three masses. The first one on your left looks like an early 18th century Connecticut house. The central one looks like a early 19th century federal house, and on the right, the one-story wing is an arts and crafts early 20th century building. But the conceit is tied together by the fact that all the window panes are exactly the same proportion, all the details of cornices, etc., are the same, and the siding ties everything together. So it's both part of history and a single building. The garden side. This is the interior of the arts and crafts section. The dining room. One of the most difficult commissions was the Humanities building at Rice University. Again, the last building site on the historic core of the university. The university's campus is punctuated by towers at important destinations. This building has a tower and relates to the original language, sort of inspired by Byzantine architecture of Ralph Adams Cram, who designed the campus. It's one of the most beautiful campuses at its core in the United States. And although this looks like it's part of the campus, in fact, all the detailing is very, very different from Cram's. But the president of the university actually got into a fight with one of the alumni who insisted, after this building was finished, that it was an old building and had been there all the time, and he, in fact, had gone to classes in it. One of the interiors. I'm sorry, this last slide was the passageway through one of the wings of the building. There you see the exterior part of the passageway. And this wall has all the bathrooms, elevators, and vertical ducts in it, so there are no windows. But the exterior, this elevation is in fact my favorite, and it just shows how you can use this language to cover what would be a service wall in any other building. This is a house owned by Caroline Rome in northwestern Connecticut, which suffered a fire, and all that was left were the surrounding concrete walls. We rebuilt it, and keeping it exactly as it was, but just adding this exterior porch. But the interior was quite different. Where there had been 6 rooms, Caroline replaced it with one large room. She has a piano on one side, and she keeps her sewing on the other, and the room is also the center of her legendary parties, particularly at Thanksgiving and Christmas. One of the most popular rooms in the house, and I have gotten, I think, more jobs from this slide than just about any other, is her china room. This is where she keeps her china. It's just off the kitchen, but came out so nicely that it is now this. People sit down here for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, small dinners, and works really well. But it shows that even a service room, like a pantry or a china room, can be really beautiful. A house in the Hamptons, very different, with a curved living room in the middle and battered walls. And an exterior room with its own private courtyard for hot summer days. In addition to the Design and Decorators building in New York, the entrance. This is a house in South Carolina, and standing on those two upstairs balconies, you really look across the ocean to Portugal. The front door of the house, again, the entrance and the garden side or the ocean side are very different. Staircase. This is the classroom building at the University of Delaware. We were hired to design this building, which includes a bridge going right on the main axis of this building across a state road to the new campus developing on the other side. The plan as it developed, the campus plan, had lost its cross-axis. We were asked to restore that, and there are only 3 buildings which have full pediments. This building, the one opposite it, and the one at the head of the green, which was the old library, and is now the computer science building. The interior of this building has a sort of student gathering place in its center that's 3 stories high with a skylight. Right at the other end of the axis is a DuPont Hall, which is a nanotechnology building, and the axis goes from here through the center of Gore Hall to the new side of the university. And this is one of the labs in this building. And the laboratory equipment that was moved in here actually cost twice as much as the building. House in Pennsylvania. The entrance side of the house with its tall chimneys and interior staircase. And this is a party room on one side of the motor court. This is a house which is on a peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides. It's a 9-square house like Palladio's Villa Rotunda. Here you see it at night from across the water. The center of the house is this 3-story high atrium space. The staircase is the only one in the house, and quite literally, Mom stands in the middle of the atrium and calls the children down to dinner or to do homework or whatever. It is the heart of the house. On the walls are scenes which portray the site as it would have looked in the 18th century. So as you look out, and every window, every door looks from one side of the house to the other. So as you walk around it, you are always looking at the water. This is Martha Stewart's farm in Upper New York, Cantito. Most of the buildings existed. They were taken down to their foundations and rebuilt with very, very slight adjustments, enhancements, and all tied together by her wonderful garden. In the monograph, this garden is photographed in spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and she really is one of the great garden designers of our time. Here are the stables with this amazing boxwood development on either side of the roadway. A house in Washington, D.C., with a formal side on the left and a family side on the right at the level of the swimming pool, all tied together by the circular staircase. The Tommy Hilfiger store on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. This building was completely prefabricated outside San Francisco in 16-foot panels, delivered to the site and assembled in 6 weeks. The second floor has a terrace covered with a pergola running around the building, so you can buy an espresso and a slice of cheesecake, as well as test the colors of the clothing you want to buy outside. The center dome in the building underneath the staircase. This is a children's playhouse modeled after Mount Vernon. And here you see the interior of the playhouse with an exact replica of George Washington's Surliana. I want to end with this two-story library in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I end with a library because as a classical architect, you have to study the past. The past is, in fact, the sources of your inspiration and the sources for your ideas. And every building you design in your mind is compared with the great architecture of the past. So it's not a matter of pulling a building, of designing a building and saying, oh, this reflects my spirit, my creative ability. You can do that, but you also have to say, how does this compare to the great houses of Charles Platt or McKimbey and White or Robert Mills or Town and Davis in the 19th century, Thomas Jefferson, who designed Monticello, of George Washington, who designed Mount Vernon, and of the great farmer, owner, architects who designed the great heritage of American 17th century architecture. And so I will say thank you very much. You've been very patient audience, and my lecture's been a little bit too long, for which I apologize. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you. Any questions? I can't believe I convinced everybody in the room. Yes, sir.
What do you like best, your orthodox work or your unorthodox?
I'm sorry,
What do you like best, whether it's a classical building or a traditional building? Some of them are very orthodox and, others are very inventive and different. Which one do you like best?
I think they're all inventive and different, but at a different scale. What you call more orthodox, the invention is really restricted to interesting detail, and particularly on the inside. The unorthodox ones are always more fun, less scholarly, and you can feel freer to invent. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Yes.
Just one more. You mentioned that growing up in South Africa and studying there offered you something that you couldn't get elsewhere. Was that even the case in '56?
Yes. You have to remember that Gropius had changed the curriculum at Harvard in the 1930s and fired the architecture school's historian, Sir Kenneth Conant, who was a world-famous historian. And many architecture schools had changed their curriculum by then. The two exceptions were Yale, under Dean Everett Meeks, and Princeton. Yale really changed, but halfway changed because Paul Rudolph was the new dean and knew as much about the past as he did about the present. He Rudolph didn't talk a lot, but he was a brilliant teacher and a brilliant critic, and the only architecture school teacher who in 1964 would have praised James Gamble Rogers' Courtyards.
I just wondered what your impression was in your observations of Miami's growth over the last 15 years.
You know, I don't know Miami very well. I love the Art Deco buildings, and Andreas once took me on a tour of Coral Gables, which I thought was amazing. It is one of the most beautiful residential precincts in the United States. Yes?
I'm just curious about your attachment to the works that you've created. Obviously, each one is such a labor of love and takes so much of your personal energies. Do you then have anxiety when you separate from them, or do you go back and visit these buildings later on?
That's a good question. The anxiety is really present when somebody buys the house and you're worried they might take it down or change it in some way. I've been very fortunate in that only one renovation that I did actually has come down. One or two houses have been changed a little bit, but I've been very lucky. And yes, your buildings are like your children, but as each child comes, it has its own personality, and you become attached to it in a different way. And the older buildings are there, sort of taking their place in history, one hopes, and the new buildings are a crisis that you have to manage as it goes along. But you always love them, yes.
We have time for one more question. I believe this one.
There's a man here.
I was curious about the house that you did with the addition that you did to the house in Connecticut that had the very modern style. And
Oh, yes, yes.
In addition to a very classical. How did you come to really find I guess the balance of trying to marry those two styles together?
You know, we tend to see modern architecture as a monolithic style, but in point of fact, it is not. The great masters of Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Alvar Aalto, and Frank Lloyd Wright are more different from each other than they are from the classic buildings of the past that they all admire. They are very, very different. And the work of the other master, Walter Gropius, is more different than the differences between the four masters I cited a few seconds ago. Gropius wanted to expunge history. These other masters are rooted in history. Mies van der Rohe, in every office he had from 1908 to his death, had a Corinthian column which he drew as a young man. He was a trained stonemason, and this was one of his student exercises. Both Le Corbusier, Gropius, and Aalto in different ways inverted the tradition and by reacting to it became part of the tradition. The Gropius school, which is the dominant school, it has taken over the entire world, is very different because it has no connection to the past. By imagining, I was taking the classical columns of the old house and creating a parallel in the steel columns which support the addition. I have slides actually comparing the two. I didn't include them. And relating the heights of the floor and the roof cornice one to the other. There is a connection between the two buildings that flows, I hope, really well together. So there's both a contrast and a family relationship. They are both buildings in which the columns are anthropomorphic. You can feel the structure through your body. They both have big glass windows. One takes over the whole facade. The other is holes cut in a wall. But you do feel the tension between them, the tension and the family relationship. It was a difficult building to work on, but I'm very proud of it.
Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you.
We'll take you to the other side for the signing. Folks, before you get up, I do have a couple of housekeeping details to let you know about. We have such a great audience here tonight. We're actually going to move Mr. Greenberg's signing over to the west side of the store. We will have the book for sale here at the east counter. We also have a stack of books over for sale at the west side counter. As soon as we finish up here, I'm going to steal Mr. Greenberg from you to take him over to the west side, and the signing line will form over there. Also, it's such a full house, if when you get up you could fold your chair and stack it against the wall, that'll be a big help in us getting this room cleared. For our internet audience at home, remember, if you want to call the number on your screen, purchase a book, we will have Mr. Greenberg sign it for you, and we will send it to you anywhere in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, that was such a beautiful presentation. Please give Mr. Greenberg another hand. Thank you very much.